A farmer thought he was just saving a horse from the mud, but what rose from that pit changed an entire valley forever. It began on a morning when the land had forgotten rain. A lonely farmer, worn by years of silence, heard a cry echoing through the mist. A sound so human it stopped his heart. What he found trapped in the mud was not just a dying horse, but the beginning of a miracle no one could explain. The Central Valley had forgotten what rain felt like. For 3 years, the wind had been dry and mean, scraping the ground until it cracked like sunburned skin. The grapevines that once painted the valley green now hung like dead nerves across acres of pale dust. Even the air smelled of metal and regret. Caleb Turner stood at the edge of his vineyard, holding a dented tin bucket filled with muddy water. He poured it over a single vine that refused to die, the soil swallowing it with a hiss. His shirt clung to his back. A faint ring of salt traced the edge of his hat brim. Behind him, the old windmill groaned, a dying heartbeat of a farm that had outlived its own future. He used to be proud of this land. His father's hands had planted the first vines here, teaching him to read the wind, to taste the air before the storm. But storms no longer came. The sky had become a stranger, distant, brittle, and quiet. Caleb squinted toward the horizon, where heat shimmered like a mirage, blurring the fence posts into nothing. Another season like this, and the valley will turn to ash, old Will Jenkins had said at the diner that morning. Caleb didn't argue. Will was right. The land was dying, and maybe, in some quiet way, so was he. Inside the farmhouse, the walls smelled faintly of oil and loneliness. A faded photograph sat on the windowsill, a woman in a yellow dress, smiling beneath a tree heavy with fruit. Martha, his wife. Gone 5 summers ago, when the last well went dry and her heart simply stopped one night. The doctors had called it failure. Caleb called it drought. Every day since, he had followed the same ritual. Wake at dawn. Check the vines. Whisper to the soil as if it might remember him. Then pour the bucket. One last act of devotion for a land that no longer answered. That afternoon, the wind shifted. Cooler, gentler, carrying the smell of distant rain. Caleb looked up. The clouds were bruising the horizon, thick and low, crawling toward the valley like an old promise. He waited, hat in hand, watching the first drop hit the porch rail, then another. It wasn't much, just a hesitant drizzle, but he stood there, letting it soak through his hat, his shirt, his skin. The sound of rain on tin was like a language he used to know by heart. He smiled without meaning to, lips trembling. For hours it rained softly, washing dust from the vines, turning the earth into something dark and sticky. The vineyard shimmered beneath the dim light, silver threads of water running down every slope. Caleb walked barefoot through the rows, feeling the mud pull gently at his feet. It wasn't thirst that made his throat ache. It was hope, fragile and absurd. By nightfall, the rain had stopped. The clouds moved on, leaving behind a sky heavy with stars. Caleb leaned against the wooden gate, listening to the soft drip from the eaves. Somewhere out in the dark, frogs croaked for the first time in years. He whispered into the night, "Maybe you're not done with me yet." Then he turned off the lantern, the soft golden light vanishing from the farmhouse window. Beyond the hills, thunder murmured, a promise unfinished. and far across the valley, under a tangle of dead willow roots, something stirred. A faint, broken sound rose through the wet air, a whinny, distant and trembling. But the farmer didn't hear it. Not yet. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that makes even the birds hesitate before singing. The world outside Caleb Turner's window smelled of wet dust and forgotten things. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind shallow pools that mirrored the empty sky. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The vineyard stretched before him like a battlefield after the storm, mud-caked vines sagging under the weight of water, broken branches tangled like ribs. Yet beneath that ruin, the air carried a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. The faint shimmer of moisture made everything look alive again. He walked down to the lowest fat field, where water had gathered in the ruts between the rows. The soil gurgled softly under his feet. He crouched, pressing his palm to the ground. It was warm beneath the surface, alive, just barely. "You're still breathing," he murmured. His voice cracked in the stillness. All morning, the valley lay in that strange hush that comes after mercy. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if it too feared breaking the fragile calm. The smell of wet earth lingered like the memory of someone who used to laugh in this house. Caleb thought of Martha, how she used to step outside after every rain, her hair dark with water, saying the land always needed to be reminded it could forgive. At noon, the sun fought its way through the clouds, and a steam rose from the ground in slow curls. The puddles began to dry, leaving dark stains of promise. He took it as a sign and brought out the old hoe from the shed. The handle was smooth from years of his father's hands. He dug a shallow trench to guide the remaining rainwater toward the roots that had survived. By afternoon, the valley was humming again. Crickets, bees, the faint clink of the windmill beginning to turn. Caleb lifted his head, squinting at the horizon. A flock of white egrets circled above the flooded meadow, their wings cutting clean lines through the pale sky. It was a picture worth keeping, he thought. Maybe the world still had a few good surprises left, but beauty, he knew, never came without cost. Down near the creek bed, the ground had collapsed under the weight of the rain, leaving a long gash filled with thick, black mud. From where he stood, it looked harmless, a smear of wet clay glinting in the sun. Still, he felt a faint unease crawling under his ribs. As the evening light thinned into amber, Caleb lingered by the broken fence, looking across the fields. The mud shimmered like spilled oil, reflecting the last orange light of day. Somewhere deep within that mire, a faint sound carried through the wind, soft, high-pitched, and desperate. He paused, listening. It came again, barely audible over the creak of the windmill. A horse? He thought. No, couldn't be. Wild horses hadn't roamed this part of the valley for years. The ranchers had driven them away during the last drought, saying there wasn't enough water for both man and beast. He waited, heart drumming quietly. Then came the sound again. Longer this time, trembling at the edges. It wasn't imagination. Something was out there. Caleb leaned against the fence post, eyes narrowing toward the far side of the property where the ground dipped out of sight. The sky was fading into violet now. He turned back toward the farmhouse, meaning to grab his flashlight. Halfway there, he stopped. The air had shifted again. The smell of rain was gone, replaced by something darker. The thick, sour scent of mud turning. He felt it then, the old instinct that farmers share with the land itself. A sense that something was not right. He looked once more toward the far field, that narrow basin of earth the rain had awakened. And in that hush between one breath and the next, he heard it again. Clearer, rawer, a sound no man could mistake. A whinny, frightened, weak. Caleb froze. The bucket in his hand slipped, water spilling into the dirt. His eyes widened toward the distance where the sound came from. No, he whispered, more to himself than the wind. Not out there. But the sound rose again, breaking the silence of the valley. He dropped the bucket and began walking, then running, mud splattering against his jeans, his boots sinking with every step. The last light of the day caught the outline of his figure moving across the wet fields, one man chasing a cry that didn't belong to him, but somehow had already found its way into his chest. He reached the basin at the far edge of the vineyard where the land dipped like a cupped hand, a place his father once called the field's weak heart. The storm had licked it open. Water pooled there, dark and viscous, a mirror cracked by reeds and tire ruts. Caleb slid down the slope, grabbing at bunches of foxtail, mud smearing his palms. The sound came again. Thin, urgent. He stopped short. It wasn't a trick of wind. It was a voice with edges. He edged around a tangle of willow roots and saw her. A wild mare, chest deep in the pit, the mud black as tar against her copper coat. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Mane pasted to her neck. Sides, heaving, nostrils flaring white with each drag of breath. One foreleg punched and sucked, but the pit held like a clenched fist. She turned her head at the scrape of his boot and froze. For a beat, the field had no sound except two hearts insisting. Easy, he said, though his throat felt full of iron. He took off his hat, as if arriving at a stranger's porch. Rain had gathered in the hollow of the mud around her chest, trembling with each breath. A torn ribbon of fence wire lay half buried nearby, winking with rust. He took a step closer. The ground pressed a wet hand against his boot and did not let go. He eased back, measuring distance the way his father taught him, by what the earth would accept. She was smaller than he expected for a wild one, fine-boned at the face, eyes clear amber rimmed in black. The left hind leg bore a pale ring of scar tissue, as if some metal had once laid a slow fire there. He recognized that kind of hurt, the kind that teaches a creature to live sideways from its own past. "Easy, girl," he said again, voice softer. The mare blinked. Breath clouded around her nostrils. Her look was not pleading, not angry. It was the look of a thing that has already learned the limits of panic, and is now spending what's left of its strength on staying upright. Caleb scanned the edge of the pit. Dead reeds. A snapped cedar post. The rope he used for hauling wire sat 30 yards back at the fence where he'd stopped earlier that morning. He could run to the truck, call someone, if anyone would come. Dry Creek wasn't kind to mouths that drank without asking. He could already hear Tom Briggs laughing into his coffee, talking about nature's accounting. Mortgage payment due on Friday. The credit card interest eating what little profit the vines might someday offer. Numbers stacked like bricks on his chest. But none of it mattered in the circle of that pit. A life was sliding away inch by inch, and he knew the measure of inches. He crouched low, testing the crust with the flat of his palm. The top layer held, a skin of clay that pretended to be ground, but the give beneath was merciless. One step too far, and he'd be where she was, caught in a soft machine that did not care. He pictured the old windmill, the empty well, Martha's photograph holding the last green summer, small reasons to live stitched together like patchwork. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked into those amber eyes. "I'm not leaving you," he said. It felt foolish to promise out loud. It also felt necessary. He climbed back up the slope and trotted the fence line, mud sucking at his heels, until he reached the coil of hemp rope hanging from a nail. He dragged it down, along with a warped length of fence board, then returned to the basin, breath short, calves burning. The board went first, laid flat across the lip to spread his weight. He eased onto it on hands and knees, fed the rope forward, looped it into a crude harness the way his father had once shown him, when a heifer calved wrong and needed a second pair of hands that the world didn't have. The mare's ears tipped, then steadied. He pulled the loop wide, testing knots with a practiced flick. "We're going to make a bridge," he told her, as if the words could dry the mud. He slid the rope along the surface, coaxing it toward her chest with the board, inch by inch. Twice it sank, and he had to reel it back, slick with black weight. The third time, the loop kissed her wet fur. She flinched, the water shivered, and the whole pit shuddered with her. "Hold," he whispered, palm raised, as if he were stopping traffic. She did. The stillness between them felt deliberate, something chosen. He nudged the rope higher, pulled the slack, and cinched the knot to seat above the ribs. Her breath hitched. He hated the sound, but loved the proof of it. He should have called Ruth Delgado. The new engineer would have the right mind for mud and angles. He should have called his home insurance adjuster last month after the wind tore the south awning free. But he hadn't wanted the paperwork, the questions. He had never been good at asking anyone for help. The rope found purchase on a willow stump. He wrapped it twice and leaned his weight into it, testing. The mare's body slid forward the width of a hoof, then stopped. The mud pulled back with a wet suck, greedy as debt. He tried again, slow pressure instead of jerking. The rope creaked. The stump answered with a tired groan. The mare shifted, found a new angle, and in that small coordination, a man leaning, an animal choosing, something like a rhythm began. He stopped before the stump cracked, lungs burning, arms trembling. He needed another anchor, another pair of hands. The sun was a dull coin pressing itself into the western hills. Time darkened. Coyotes would come to the edges soon, curious accountants of the valley's losses. He could picture a flashlight beam in Ruth's capable grip, the way she measured things without cruelty. He could picture the diner window steaming, Will Jenkins telling anyone who would listen that a farmer had gone soft for a wild mare. Let them talk. He untied the rope from the stump and resecured it, closer to the strongest root. He tried once more, easing tension with his weight until the board beneath his knees flexed like a sigh. The mare's right foreleg lifted out of the suction a hand's breadth, trembling in the air before settling back. That tiny rise robbed him of breath. It was enough to prove the world could be moved, if only a little. His arms quivered from effort. Mud crawled cold through a tear at his knee. Behind him, The basin's slope glistened with the day's last light, smooth as poured metal. He felt very small, very breakable, and very sure that leaving now would cost him something he could not afford. Not money, not vines, something older. He sat back on his heels and met the ewe, mare's gaze again. The wind had changed. Cooler. A hint of willow and iron. She blinked, slow. The black rim around her iris made the amber glow like a coal. He glanced toward the farmhouse, the dark square of a window just visible above the vines. If he ran, he could make it there and back in 10 minutes with the truck, the longer chain, the come-along winch. If he stayed, he might buy her those 10 minutes with the pressure of a rope and the quiet of his voice. He made a decision so quietly, even the mud didn't hear it. He stood, collected the rope, and backed up the slope, not taking his eyes from her until the last step found grass. At the top, he paused, catching his breath. The mare flicked an ear, as if taking a picture of him with her attention. "Hold on," he said to the trembling air, to the animal, to the piece of himself he'd left at the edge of the pit. "I'll come back." The headlights of Caleb's truck carved through the fog like slow knives. He drove back down the dirt lane, the ruts already swallowing the sound of his tires. The rope coiled beside him, and the winch rattled against the metal floor. Each bump in the road drummed through the steering wheel straight into his chest. He told himself he was just tired, that he didn't owe anything to a creature that would bolt the second she was free. But his hands never left the wheel. When he reached the basin again, night had taken the valley whole. The mud pit glistened faintly under the truck's beams, a mirror of slick darkness. He cut the engine. For a moment there was nothing but the ticking of cooling metal and the faint hiss of frogs starting their evening song. Then the air trembled. The sound he'd feared might be gone. A low, rasping whinny. Still alive. Caleb took the winch and rope, moving slowly down the slope. The mud grabbed at his boots, and each step made a thick, wet sound. The mare's eyes caught the beam, reflecting it back like molten gold. She had stopped struggling. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, her breath fogging the cold air. "Easy, girl," he whispered, the same words he'd used before. They felt heavier now. He set the winch against a root and looped the rope again, careful not to splash. The smell was sharp. Earth, iron, decay. Somewhere under it, the faint sweetness of hay that had blown in from the neighboring ranch. He spoke softly as he worked. "You made it through the storm. That means something." The mare blinked, her ears tilting toward his voice. When he took a step closer, she tensed but didn't thrash. Caleb crouched, his jeans sinking into the cold muck. He reached out, touching the rope around her chest. The texture of her coat surprised him. Silky under the grit, warm even soaked in mud. He felt the tremor of her heartbeat through the rope. "Hold on," he said again, almost to himself. He began cranking the winch. It clicked with a rhythm that matched his pulse. Steady, deliberate, mechanical. The rope tightened, cutting a faint line through the mud. The mare grunted, shifting her weight. For a moment, nothing moved. Then her front leg tore free with a wet gasp. Caleb froze. The sudden release could break bone if the tension went wrong. He waited until she steadied, then eased the rope again. The process was slow, measured by inches and breaths, Mud suctioned and released like a lung. Each pull stole a little strength from him, but gave the animal another fraction of life. His arms burned, his back screamed, the winch handle dug into his palm until blood slicked the metal, but he didn't stop. The mare's breathing grew louder, ragged but certain. Halfway through the drag, the board beneath his knee split with a crack. Caleb fell forward, catching himself with one hand in the mud. The rope snapped taut, jerking the mare. She cried out, high, raw, wild, and the sound ripped through him. He cursed under his breath, found his footing, and eased the tension. "Sorry," he murmured. "I've got you. I've got you." He worked slower after that. The pit swallowed the sounds, the clicks, the breath, the whisper of rope. The world outside seemed to disappear until there was only man, beast, and mud. The air thickened with the smell of sweat and rain that refused to leave. Finally, with one last pull, her hindquarters slid free. She staggered, but didn't fall, standing trembling at the edge of the pit, legs shaking. Caleb let go of the handle and fell backward onto the ground, his chest heaving. He couldn't tell if the wetness on his face was sweat or tears. The mare turned her head, studying him. Her gaze was steady now, no longer frantic. For a few seconds, they stared at each other. The valley around them was utterly silent. No wind, no frogs, just the faint sound of her breathing, and his answering it. Caleb had never believed in miracles. But in that quiet, he felt something he hadn't felt since Martha died. A moment that didn't need words to mean everything. "Go on," he said softly. But she didn't move. She stayed there, shaking, sides heaving, mud dripping from her tail. Then, with a slow, shivering sigh, she stepped forward. The truck's headlights caught the gleam of her body, every scar and ripple. She walked past him, brushing his shoulder with her flank, and stood on solid ground. He could smell her now. Earth, rain, the faint trace of life clinging to every hair. Caleb stayed on the ground, staring up at the thin slice of moon above them. He couldn't remember when he'd last looked at the sky without flinching. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to thank something. God, fate, or just the stubbornness of living things. He didn't say it aloud. The silence was answer enough. When he rose, his body protested. The mare was still there, watching him. Her tail flicked once, then she turned her head toward the dark fields beyond the vineyard. Somewhere out there, maybe, was where she'd come from. The wild. Freedom. He took a cautious step forward. "You can go," he said, voice low. "You don't owe me anything." But she didn't move. She just stood in the beam of light, her chest rising with slow, exhausted rhythm. And then, like a whisper, she bowed her head. Barely, but enough for him to see it. A gesture too deliberate to be chance. Gratitude, maybe, or simply the way light bent across her form. Caleb turned off the truck's lights. Darkness folded over them both. He stood still, listening to the faint rustle as she shifted her weight. Then he turned toward the house. Behind him came the sound of hooves squelching softly through the mud, following. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The next morning came wrapped in the color of dust. A pale sun climbed over the hills, but its light was thin, like it was afraid to touch the land. Caleb's hands were raw from the rope, his back sore from the night's work. Yet there was something new in the air, a quiet pulse beneath the silence, like the earth was waiting to see what he'd do next. The mare stood near the corral behind his barn, legs caked in drying mud, her coat already taking back its copper sheen. She ate the hay he'd spread on the ground, careful and slow, every movement wary. When he stepped closer, she raised her head, ears twitching, but didn't run. The sight of her alive filled him with a strange, nervous warmth. He poured water into an old trough and watched her drink. Her throat moved, the sound small but steady. "You've got some fight left," he murmured. The name came to him without thought. Sienna. It fit her, that blend of earth and fire. She blinked, and for a moment the barnyard felt like a place worth standing in again. By noon, word had traveled. In a town like Dry Creek, news moved faster than rain clouds. When Caleb drove into town for supplies, the chatter started before he'd even turned off the engine. Outside the hardware store, Tom Briggs leaned against his truck, arms crossed, grin sharp as a knife. "Heard you went and saved one of those wild devils," Tom said, loud enough for the others to hear. "Could have saved yourself the trouble. Those things break fences, ruin crops, drain the water. Should have let the mud take it." Caleb kept his voice even. "Wasn't her fault she got stuck." Tom laughed. "Fault's got nothing to do with it. It's balance. Out here, you let nature clean its own mess." A few others nodded. The men were ranchers, grape growers, men who'd fought the same drought, who'd watched their wells dry and their animals die. Their eyes held the dull shine of people who'd given up believing in miracles. Caleb felt the old tension rise in his chest. He could argue, but what was the point? No one ever changed their mind in the middle of Main Street. He bought the feed, the antiseptic, and a coil of fresh rope, then walked back to the truck. The conversation behind him died, replaced by the scrape of boots on gravel. As he turned the key, someone tapped the window. It was Ruth Delgado, the new hydrologist who'd moved in 3 months ago. Her hair was tied back, her boots muddy from fieldwork. "You really found a wild horse?" she asked. "Found her," he said. "Pulled her out of a pit by the vineyard." Her expression softened. "They don't come down from the ridge much anymore. She's lucky." "I don't know if lucky's the word," Caleb replied. "She's got scars on her leg. Someone chained her once." Ruth frowned. "That's not the wild doing. That's us." She hesitated, studying his face. "You mind if I come by later? I'd like to see her." He nodded. "Bring patience. She doesn't trust easy." Back at the farm, the wind carried a different scent. Warm metal, cut hay, the faint sweetness of grapes trying to ripen again. Caleb fixed the broken latch on the corral gate and checked the rope burns on his palms. The skin was torn, but the pain grounded him. Every small task, the hammer strike, the tightening of nails, felt heavier with purpose. When Ruth arrived near sunset, she walked slowly, giving Sienna time to notice. The mare stood near the fence, head high, nostrils flaring. Ruth stopped a few paces away and whispered, "She's beautiful." "She's wild," Caleb said. "That's not the same thing." Ruth smiled faintly. "Wild things are only dangerous when they've been hurt." She crouched, letting the mare sniff her hand through the fence. After a moment, Sienna stepped closer, curiosity edging out fear. "See?" Ruth said softly. "Not all distance is mistrust." Caleb watched the two of them in the fading light, the world slowing around the rhythm of breathing. Man, woman, animal, air. It had been a long time since he'd seen anything that quiet feel safe. When Ruth left, she turned at the gate. "The others won't understand, Caleb. People out here see kindness as weakness." He nodded, eyes still on the mare. "They can see what they want. I'm too old to explain myself." Night came early. The cicadas sang from the vines. Caleb sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the corral where Sienna stood like a bronze statue in moonlight. Every few minutes, she flicked her tail, the sound small but certain, a heartbeat against the stillness. He thought of what Tom had said. "Let the mud take it." The words echoed like a threat, but also a test. He'd failed to save too many things before. The land, his marriage, his own faith. Not this time. As he rose to head inside, a low rumble rolled through the distance. Not thunder. Engines. A convoy of trucks moving across the back road, their lights flashing briefly through the vines. Caleb frowned. Wild horse trappers sometimes ran night drives along the ridge, rounding up strays for profit. He hadn't heard of them this close to Dry Creek in years. He glanced toward Sienna. She was alert now, ears pricked, muscles tight. For the first time since he'd pulled her from the mud, fear returned to her eyes. Caleb felt a cold knot twist in his gut. "Easy," he said, though he wasn't sure which of them needed calming more. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching the red taillights fade into the dark, then turned back toward the mare. Her gaze met his through the half-shadow. Whatever storm was coming, it wasn't over yet. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time Caleb closed his eyes, he saw the mare's face half buried in mud, her eyes rolling white under the truck's beam. He woke before dawn to the smell of cold air and wet earth. Outside, the world was still gray, a thin mist rising off the fields like breath. Somewhere out in the dark, coyotes called to one another, their voices fading into the hills. Sienna was already awake. She stood near the fence, head lifted, her coat catching the first light. The scar around her hind leg gleamed pale in the morning fog. When Caleb stepped out of the house, she turned her head slightly but didn't move away. That simple gesture, the absence of fear, felt like a kind of grace. He fed her from his hand, bits of apple left over from the kitchen. Her muzzle brushed his palm, rough and warm. For a heartbeat, he remembered Martha again, how she used to feed the chickens at sunrise, whispering to them like old friends. He'd forgotten the sound of his own voice, softened by care. By mid-morning, Ruth returned in her old government truck. Mud splattered up the sides. She carried a clipboard, a thermos, and the same calm that made her presence quiet everything around her. "You weren't kidding," she said, looking at Sienna. "She's wild, but she's listening." Caleb shrugged. "Listening doesn't mean trusting." Ruth smiled. "Neither does talking." She circled the corral, noting the uneven ground. "The storm hit harder here than I thought. The creek bed's eroded. You might have more sinkholes forming." Caleb followed her gaze. The thought made his stomach tighten. "You think that pit wasn't the only one?" "I think the land remembers every drought," she said. "When it finally drinks, it breaks where it's weakest." He nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. "Same with people." She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to the scars on his hands. They worked side by side the rest of the morning, clearing debris and mending fences. The rhythm of it steadied him. The thud of the hammer, the smell of cedar, the way the sun finally burned through the fog. For a while, they didn't need words. After lunch, Caleb took the old canteen and walked down toward the lower field. The ground squelched underfoot, each step releasing the smell of iron and rot. He reached the edge of the pit where he'd found Sienna. The mud had hardened on top, but beneath the crust it still moved with a slow pulse. He squatted, touching the cracked surface. It was cool and slick, as if alive. A memory rose sharp and unwelcome. The night his well had run dry 5 years ago. He'd been down there too, waist deep, trying to unclog the pipe with his bare hands while Martha shouted for him to stop. He hadn't stopped then either. The water came back for one day, then turned to dust. 2 months later, she was gone. He rubbed the mud between his fingers, the weight of guilt pressing harder than the earth beneath him. "You always tried to fix what wasn't yours to fix," Martha had once said. "Some things just need time." But time had never healed anything out here. It just took pieces of you, until there was nothing left to give. A sound behind him made him turn. Sienna stood at the top of the slope, watching him. Her mane fluttered in the breeze, streaks of gold cutting through the brown. She took one tentative step forward, then another, the ground cracking softly under her hooves. Caleb raised a hand. "Stay back," he said. "This place isn't safe." The mare hesitated, then stopped. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small distance, man and animal bound by the same fragile ground. Ruth's voice broke the silence. "Caleb!" She was walking toward them, waving a folded map. "You'll want to see this." He climbed the slope, brushing mud off his jeans. Ruth spread the map over a rock. I compared old survey charts. The underground channels still exist, somewhere beneath your vineyard. If the pressure builds again, water could return. Caleb frowned. "After all these years?" She nodded. "Sometimes it just needs a way through." They stood there in the sun, the map fluttering in the wind. Caleb looked back toward Sienna, still at the edge of the pit, head tilted as if listening. "Maybe she already found it," he said quietly. Ruth followed his gaze. "What do you mean?" She went into the mud chasing something. Maybe scent, maybe sound. Maybe the land was already calling. Ruth smiled faintly. "You sound like an old ranch poet." He chuckled once. "I sound like a fool talking to dirt." But that night, long after Ruth had left, he dreamed of the pit again. Only this time, it wasn't Sienna sinking. It was him. The mud climbed his chest, cool and suffocating, and he heard her breathing somewhere above him, strong and even. He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of his own gasp echoing in the room. He stepped outside. The sky was moonless, black and heavy. From the corral came a soft rustle. Sienna was awake too, shifting her weight, her ears twitching toward the hills. Caleb leaned on the rail. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered. The mare turned her head. Her eyes caught what little starlight there was, glowing faintly gold. Then she gave a low nicker, deep and steady, before lowering her head to the ground. In that stillness, Caleb felt the same truth Ruth had spoken earlier. The land breaks where it's weakest, but it also heals where it's touched. He looked toward the pit one last time before going in. The surface shimmered faintly, as if something below it was moving again. Morning broke with a restless wind sweeping across Dry Creek Valley. The air carried the scent of dust and dew, that delicate line between drought and promise. Caleb woke before the first light touched the hills, the weight of last night's dream still clinging to his chest. He had dreamed of Sienna again, her hooves striking the ground above him, each impact echoing like a heartbeat through the earth. When he stepped outside, she was gone. For one wild second, his stomach dropped. The corral gate hung open, chain unhooked but not broken. He scanned the field. No prints in the damp soil, no movement beyond the vines. The windmill creaked lazily, mocking his panic. Then he saw her, standing down near the old oak, grazing among the tall grass as if she'd always belonged there. Caleb exhaled and leaned against the fence post, a half laugh, half prayer escaping his throat. "You'll be the death of me," he said under his breath. She raised her head at the sound, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded, unconcerned. After breakfast, Ruth arrived again, this time carrying a small first aid kit and a portable ultrasound wand for soil mapping. "I thought you might need a hand checking her leg," she said, "and maybe I'll take another reading near the lower field." Sienna's ears flicked toward the newcomer. She stood still while Ruth crouched, the morning light sliding across the mare's scarred leg. "She's healing," Ruth murmured. "You did good." Caleb didn't answer. He was watching the hills. The night before, he'd heard engines out that way, the kind that didn't belong to farmers. "The trappers have been running near the ridge again," he said finally. "You think they'd come this far down?" Ruth looked up at him. "For the right price, they'd come anywhere." The thought tightened something in his gut. He'd pulled Sienna from death once. The idea of someone dragging her away in chains made his jaw clench. "They won't touch her," he said. "Caleb," Ruth warned gently, "you can't fight the whole valley." "Not the valley," he said, "just the ones who think it still belongs to them." He spent the rest of the day strengthening the corral fence and moving tools from the shed. Sienna watched him from the shade, tail flicking lazily. Every now and then she would step closer, nosing the air between them. There was trust now, fragile, trembling, but real. As the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the sky in amber and ash, Caleb filled the trough again. The well water came up clearer than he remembered, cold and tasting faintly of minerals. He let it run longer than usual, listening to the steady rush. Maybe Ruth was right. Maybe something underground had shifted. Sienna approached the sound of water, lowering her head to drink. The reflection in the trough shimmered. A man lined with years and a horse marked by scars, side by side under the dying light. It felt almost holy, though neither of them believed in anything that easy. Later, Ruth joined him on the porch. The air smelled of alfalfa and distant smoke. Somewhere a coyote barked once, then went silent. "You ever think the land knows who it belongs to?" she asked. Caleb sipped his coffee, eyes on the darkening field. "I think it remembers who listens." She smiled faintly. "Then it's remembering you." Before he could answer, Sienna let out a sharp, startled snort. She turned toward the hills, muscles tensing. Caleb set down his cup. From far away came a faint metallic rattle, chains, or maybe the clatter of a gate. Then headlights flashed briefly along the ridge. Ruth swore under her breath. "The trappers!" Caleb was already moving. He grabbed his coat, the same rope he'd used in the rescue, and a flashlight. "Stay here," he said. "Don't you dare go alone." But he was already halfway down the slope, the beam of his light bouncing off the wet soil. The night was alive with the smell of diesel and dust. He could hear the low rumble of engines now, the kind that prowled slow and sure, hunting by patience. At the edge of the lower field, he found tire marks. Fresh. The mud pit shimmered under the moonlight like a wound that refused to close. Caleb's heart hammered as he listened. The noise had moved farther west, toward the ridge road. He turned back toward the house, breath sharp, only to find Sienna blocking his path. She stood on the ridge above him, mane whipping in the wind, eyes fixed on the dark beyond. Her chest rose and fell like a bellows, the muscles under her coat catching the moonlight. "Get back!" he called, waving an arm. "Go home, girl!" But she didn't move. She pawed the ground once, twice, then gave a short, defiant snort. The sound rolled down the hill like thunder. Caleb froze. The noise from the trucks stuttered, then faded. For a long moment, the night held its breath. Then, slowly, the engines turned, retreating toward the main road. The lights disappeared, one by one. Sienna stayed where she was until the last echo died. Then she looked down at him, the wind lifting her mane like a flag. Caleb stared up, unable to speak. There was something ancient in her stance, not fear, not anger, but command. When she finally turned and walked back toward the house, her hooves barely made a sound. Caleb followed at a distance, shaken. He didn't believe in signs, but he couldn't ignore what he'd just seen. The wild had spoken, and for once, the valley had listened. Back at the corral, she settled near the fence. Calm again. Caleb leaned on the rail, watching her breath rise and fall. "Sienna," he said softly, "you just saved us both again." She flicked an ear, indifferent, and lowered her head to graze. The wind had died completely. The night smelled of new rain the next. Day broke, bright and hard, as if the world wanted to pretend nothing had happened. But Caleb could still feel the echo of the engines in his bones, that deep vibration that stays long after sound is gone. The town of Dry Creek looked the same, quiet, sun-bleached, and half asleep, but the people inside it had already heard. At the diner, conversation stopped when he walked in. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Someone muttered, "The fool and his horse," just loud enough to sting. Caleb ignored it. He'd come for coffee and supplies, not redemption. He'd learned a long time ago that in small towns, gossip was a kind of currency, cheap to spend, impossible to erase. Ruth was there, sitting by the window with a stack of maps. She waved him over. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," he said, sliding into the booth. "They came close last night. Too close." She nodded, eyes narrowing. "Tom Briggs is behind it. I saw one of his trucks by the Ridge Road. He's been bragging about bringing the wild herds down for profit." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He won't get near her again." Ruth studied him for a long moment. "You can't keep her forever, Caleb. She's not a pet. You saved her, yes, but she belongs out there." "I know." He looked down into his coffee, the reflection of the window cutting through the black surface. "I just don't know how to let her go yet." Ruth's voice softened. "Maybe that's what this is about. Learning how." He didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin sign that read Dry Creek Cafe. The sound was small, but it carried something hollow, something like warning. By the time he got home, the light had shifted, the kind of afternoon glare that bleaches color from everything. Sienna was restless, pacing the corral, her tail flicking sharply at invisible flies. The air was heavy, electric. Caleb could feel it too, that strange pressure that settles before a storm. He reached out to calm her, but she jerked away, nostrils flaring. "Easy," he said, stepping back. The windmill moaned overhead. A line of crows crossed the sky in hurried formation. Somewhere far off, thunder cracked. Deep, rolling, and close enough to shake the barn doors. He looked toward the ridge. Dust. Not storm clouds. Trucks. His stomach turned cold. He grabbed his rifle, though he didn't want to use it, and strode toward the fence line. The trucks crept along the distant hill like beetles under the sun, their silhouettes shimmering. "Not today," he muttered. Behind him, Sienna reared suddenly, hooves cutting the air. The sound tore through the stillness. Caleb turned in time to see her break the latch clean off the corral gate. For a heartbeat, he thought she was bolting. But she didn't run far. She stopped at the edge of the vineyard, head high, ears locked on the ridge. Her entire body trembled with focus. The trucks slowed, then stopped. One engine revved twice, an ugly growl that carried through the valley. Caleb raised his rifle, but didn't fire. He stood there in the open, facing them, the wind clawing at his jacket. After a moment, the trucks turned away, tires spinning dirt as they retreated toward town. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise. When he turned back, Sienna was still there. The tension drained from her muscles. She walked toward him, slow and deliberate, until they stood only a few feet apart. Her sides heaved from exertion, but her eyes were calm again, steady, knowing. Caleb reached out, laying a hand against her neck. The heat of her skin pulsed beneath his fingers. "Guess you scared them off," he said. "Maybe you were right to break free." She leaned into his touch, just slightly, the briefest pressure, then stepped back. The sky darkened fully then, clouds sweeping in from the coast. Rain began to fall. Not soft this time, but heavy, each drop smacking the ground like it meant to wake the earth. Caleb and Sienna stood there in it, unmoving. The rain streaked down her flanks, cutting rivers through the dried mud still clinging to her. She looked cleaner somehow, more herself. The water slicked his hair to his forehead, ran into his eyes, but he didn't move to shelter. In that downpour, the vineyard came alive. The vines drank greedily. The dry soil turned dark and fragrant. Caleb could smell everything: the grass, the metal, the electricity of renewal. When the storm finally broke apart, the air was sharp with ozone. The field shimmered in twilight, puddles catching fragments of orange light from the sinking sun. Sienna stood near the fence again, shaking out her mane. Her coat glowed under the bruised sky, bronze turning almost crimson. He spoke softly into the quiet, the words half prayer, half confession. "You were meant to be free, weren't you? Not chained here, not tied to my guilt." Sienna turned her head toward him. The wind carried the faint scent of her, wild and warm. He took a step forward, but she moved away. Not far, just enough to remind him that closeness was a privilege, not a right. Ruth's truck appeared over the hill, headlights blinking through the mist. She parked near the barn and got out, shielding her face from the drizzle. "I saw the storm rolling in," she called. "Wanted to make sure you weren't out here doing something stupid." Caleb gave a small, tired grin. Too late for that. She walked to his side, eyes following the mare. "She's something, isn't she?" "She is," he said. "And she's not mine." They stood in silence, watching as Sienna moved through the field, each step sure, measured. She stopped at the far end where the vineyard met the open plain and looked back at them, framed by the fading light. Then, without sound or hesitation, she turned toward the horizon and began to walk. Ruth touched his arm. "You're letting her go?" He nodded slowly. "I think she already decided." They watched until the shape of the mare disappeared into the blur of dusk, swallowed by the distance between freedom and farewell. The rain had left the earth steaming, and in that haze, the land looked almost alive again. Caleb whispered to the wind, "Thank you." He didn't know if he was speaking to the horse, the storm, or the piece of himself he'd finally learned to forgive. The storm passed in the night, leaving the valley rinsed clean and trembling under a pale dawn. The air smelled of wet sage and ash from a brush fire far to the west. Caleb walked through the vineyard barefoot, mud sucking at his heels, the earth soft for the first time in years. Every vine glistened, tiny beads of water catching the early light. It should have felt like victory, but the emptiness in the corral reminded him otherwise. Sienna was gone. He'd known she would leave. Still, the sight of that open gate hit him harder than he'd expected. Her hoofprints were easy to find at first, wide, firm impressions cutting through the softened soil, but they grew faint as they climbed toward the ridge. He followed them anyway, climbing the trail that curved around the broken creek bed. Each print was like a fading heartbeat, a trail written in patience and silence. Halfway up, he stopped to catch his breath. The wind swept across the valley, cool and alive. He looked back and saw the farmhouse below, small and square, surrounded by fields that finally looked like they were breathing again. Ruth had said the land would heal where it was touched. Maybe she was right. The tracks led him to a place he hadn't walked in years, a shallow hollow between two ridges, half hidden by mesquite. Once, it had been a holding pen for cattle, back before the drought took the grass and the fences fell. Now it was just bones of wood and rust. He ducked under a leaning post and froze. The air here felt different, charged, uneasy. At the center of the hollow, a patch of dirt had been churned black and slick. And there, hanging from a low branch, was an old length of chain. The links were rusted, but the shape of it made his stomach twist. The end still carried a small, broken buckle, the kind used for livestock or horses. He reached up and touched it. The metal was cold and flaked under his fingers. When he pulled, the whole thing came loose with a soft, metallic sigh. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of it in his palm. This, he realized, was what had scarred Sienna's leg. Maybe years ago. Maybe not that long. The sound of hooves made him turn. She was there. Standing on the edge of the clearing, mane tangled, coat dark from rain. For a moment, neither moved. The morning light caught the curve of her scar, turning it silver. Caleb dropped the chain, the links landing in the mud with a dull clatter. Sienna flinched at the sound, then stepped forward, cautious but steady. "It's over," he said softly, though he knew she didn't need the words. "Whatever they did to you, it's over now." She came closer until he could see the small flecks of amber in her eyes. They weren't wild anymore, but they weren't tame either. She was something in between, a creature that belonged to no one but understood everything. He reached out, stopping short of touching her. The last few feet were hers to choose. Slowly, Sienna bridged the distance, pressing her muzzle against his open palm. The warmth of her breath trembled against his skin. The gesture was brief, but it carried more forgiveness than he'd ever known how to ask for. Then she turned her head toward the north, toward the open land that stretched past the ridge. Caleb followed her gaze. The storm clouds were breaking apart, sunlight flooding the far hills. He understood then that she hadn't been running from him. She'd been leading him here. To this place, to this proof. He picked up the chain again, coiling it carefully. "You showed me," he said quietly. "You remembered what they did, and still came back." Sienna pawed the ground once, then backed away. The light shifted, breaking over her in bright streaks of gold. She lifted her head and gave a long, low whinny that rolled through the valley like a song. The sound wasn't fear or warning. It was release. Caleb tied the chain around the old post, tight and final, then left it there. When he turned back, Sienna was already walking toward the ridge, her stride easy, sure. He didn't call after her. Some goodbyes are better silent. The walk home felt different. The sun was stronger now, the air warmer. He passed the vineyard and noticed tiny green shoots curling up from the soil where nothing had grown for years. It made him stop. He knelt, brushing dirt from the fragile stems, and laughed softly under his breath. Life was stubborn. So was he. When he reached the porch, Ruth was waiting. She had a clipboard in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. "You look like you've been climbing mountains," she said. "Only one," he replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. She studied him. "Find her?" He nodded. "For a while." "And?" "She found what she was looking for," he said. "So did I." Ruth smiled, but her eyes shone with something quieter than joy. "You should come by town later. The community's talking about reopening the irrigation channels. Might finally get some funding to bring water back." Caleb looked out toward the field, where sunlight flashed off the wet soil like glass. "Maybe the water's already coming." That evening, he sat on the porch again. The chain still hung heavy in his mind, but it didn't ache anymore. Across the valley, thunderheads drifted west, leaving behind a faint rainbow, faint but real. He took off his hat and let the wind pass through his hair. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a horse called once, clear and strong, fading into the horizon. He smiled, half to himself. "Be free, Sienna," he said, and, for the first time in years, he believed the land had heard him. By the time the next week came, the valley had turned a color Caleb barely recognized. Green. Not lush, not full, but green enough to make a man stop walking and stare. The vines were sprouting again, thin shoots curling upward like fingers testing the air. Each morning he checked them as if they might vanish overnight, like some miracle the land hadn't meant to keep. Ruth came by on Thursday with new equipment for soil testing, her boots caked with mud from the lower fields. "You won't believe this," she said, setting the scanner down. "The groundwater level rose by almost 3 inches in 5 days. I thought the readings were wrong, but they're consistent across every point." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. "That's not possible. We haven't had that much rain." "Exactly." Ruth crouched, unrolling a map over the tailgate of his truck. "There's pressure building underground. Something shifted. Maybe the old aquifer woke up." He traced a calloused finger along the faded blue lines that marked the channels. "The aquifer runs right under Miller's Hollow," he said. "That's where I found the chain." Ruth's eyes flicked up. "Maybe your wild horse knew something we didn't." He didn't answer. A gust of wind rattled the grape leaves, sending droplets of dew scattering into the air. The sound was faint, like applause from the earth itself. Later that day, Caleb walked out toward the hollow. The sun was high, and the air shimmered above the ground. He passed the fence line where the chain still hung, catching light like an old memory. The dirt around it looked darker, moist. He crouched, pressing a hand to the soil. It was cool, damp, and he swore he felt it, vibrating faintly, as if something deep below was breathing again. He dug with his bare hands, just enough to turn the earth. Water seeped up, thin and clear, filling the shallow depression. It wasn't much, but it spread, slow and patient, forming a tiny mirror of sky. Caleb leaned back on his heels, unable to speak. The valley's silence answered him. That night, he couldn't sleep. The air inside the house was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at it under the kitchen light, remembering how his father used to say, "You don't own water, you borrow it from the next drought." Near midnight, headlights swept across his window. He stepped outside and saw Ruth climbing from her truck, excitement lighting her face. "You have to see this," she said. "The well by the North Road, it's flowing again. Just started tonight." They drove out together, the truck bumping over uneven ground. The moon hung low, half covered by clouds. When they reached the site, Caleb could hear it before he saw it. The low, steady rush of running water. The old pipe that had been dry for almost a decade now streamed clear, steady, endless. Ruth crouched beside it, dipping her hand into the flow. "You understand what this means, right?" she said, breathless. "The aquifer's reconnected. This land isn't dead anymore." Caleb stared at the water as it caught the moonlight, every ripple throwing silver across the mud. He thought of Sienna, of the scar around her leg, of the way she'd looked toward the ridge before vanishing. "She led me to it," he thought, "to the place where the land still remembers how to live." He stepped forward, letting the cold water run over his hands. It smelled clean, like stone and iron. For the first time in years, he didn't taste bitterness on his tongue. Ruth stood beside him, quiet for once. "She brought it back," she said finally. Caleb nodded. "Maybe she just reminded us where to look." They stayed until the stars faded, the horizon blushing pale pink. When they returned to the farmhouse, the first light of morning touched the vines, turning the drops on their leaves into sparks. Caleb filled a bucket from the new flow and poured it at the base of the nearest plant. The soil drank deeply, darkening, holding on. He looked toward the ridge where the horse had disappeared and whispered, "You did it, girl." Behind him, the wind stirred through the vines, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and sage. He could have sworn it carried another sound too, faint but certain, a whinny rolling across the valley like a prayer returned. By noon, the irrigation channels began to fill again. The whole valley shimmered with thin threads of water weaving through the dirt. The land that had once cracked open under the sun now gleamed like glass. Farmers came out from town to see it for themselves, shaking their heads, muttering about impossible luck. Caleb said nothing. He just stood by the fence, mud drying on his boots, eyes fixed on the horizon. Dry Creek was alive again, and beneath its skin, the water moved. Patient, timeless, and grateful. 2 weeks passed, and Dry Creek no longer looked like a wound. The valley had changed quietly, the way a person heals in sleep. Where there had been dust, now grass brushed the ankles. Where there had been silence, water whispered through new channels, tracing silver veins across the fields. The wind smelled of clover and wet bark. For the first time in years, birds nested near the irrigation ditch. Caleb walked the property at dawn, the same route he'd walked every morning for decades, but each step felt different now. The mud underfoot was soft and giving, not the dry, cracked pain it used to be. The vines stretched upward, greedy for the sun. He reached down and ran his thumb along a leaf, surprised by the strength in it. "Welcome back," he said quietly. At the far edge of the field, Ruth was setting up new survey markers. She'd been staying in town longer than she'd planned, documenting the sudden resurgence. The government would want data, charts, reports. But to Caleb, the truth was simpler. The valley had forgiven them. He walked up beside her. "Any more readings from the well?" "Still rising," she said. "Slow, steady. It's like something down there woke up and decided to breathe again." She looked out over the shimmering field. "You realize you're standing on the kind of environmental miracle that'll end up in textbooks, right?" Caleb smiled faintly. "I'll settle for grapes that don't shrivel before harvest." Ruth laughed, but her eyes softened. "You ever think about what comes next?" He looked toward the ridge. "I think about her. Wonder if she knows." "She knows," Ruth said. "Animals feel things we don't give them credit for. Maybe she can feel this from miles away." They worked in silence after that. The air was still, except for the sound of water moving underground, an invisible river humming under their boots. Caleb thought of all the years he'd blamed the land for dying, when maybe it had only been waiting for someone to listen. By late afternoon, the heat built again. He retreated to the porch, where the boards were warm under his bare feet. From there he could see everything: the vines, the orchard, the creek bed that now shimmered faintly in the distance. He poured himself a glass of cool water and sat in the shade. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. A sound drew his eyes upward. In the distance, on the ridge, a single horse stood against the light. Even from here, he knew it was her. The copper gleam of her coat caught the last gold of the day. She wasn't moving, just watching. The sight held him so still he forgot to breathe. "Ruth," he called softly. She stepped out beside him, following his gaze. It's her," he whispered. Sienna raised her head slightly, the wind rippling her mane. Then she stepped forward, down the slope, not running, not cautious, just moving like she belonged there. Each stride caught a sliver of light until she looked like fire walking across the earth. When she reached the lower fence, she stopped. The world went utterly quiet. Caleb set down his glass and walked toward her. Ruth stayed on the porch, watching. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, until he was close enough to see the small flecks of white around her muzzle, the faint shimmer of water clinging to her coat. "You found your way back," he said softly. Sienna's ears twitched. She didn't step closer, but she didn't turn away either. For a long while, they just looked at each other. There was no fear in her now, no tremor of flight. Only recognition, the kind that has nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with memory. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a single grape, half-ripe, warm from the sun. He held it out on his open palm. "You brought the water back," he said. "Seems fair I share what it gave me." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, carefully, she lowered her head, teeth brushing his skin as she took the offering. He felt her breath, steady and alive. When she lifted her head again, her eyes caught the reflection of the vineyard behind him, the land reborn, glimmering under the evening light. "Go on," he whispered. "It's yours, too." She turned slowly, the light tracing her shape until she was nothing but a silhouette against the setting sun. At the ridge, she paused and looked back one last time. The wind lifted, bending the new grass in waves. Then she disappeared over the crest, her shadow melting into the horizon. Ruth joined him at the fence. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, she came back to see it. Maybe she came back to say goodbye. Ruth nodded. And maybe not. Caleb smiled, eyes still fixed on the ridge. Doesn't matter. Some things you don't need to know. You just feel. The sun slipped lower, turning the sky the color of copper. The last of its light caught the water channels, making them blaze like a map of veins running through the land. It looked alive, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat again. Ruth rested her arm on the fence. You think it'll last? He took a deep breath. The air was rich now, full, heavy with life. If we remember to listen, he said. They stood there until the light died, two figures framed against the wide, breathing valley. The night came quietly, but not empty. The frogs had returned to the creek, their calls soft and sure. In the distance, faint but certain, came the low, familiar whinny of a horse, a sound that rolled across the land like a benediction. Caleb closed his eyes. The sound faded into the dark, but its echo stayed, deep and steady as the pulse of the earth. The first frost came late that year, hesitant, almost shy, like the land didn't want to let go of its own rebirth. Morning light spilled across Dry Creek Valley, glinting off the thin crust of ice that had settled in the irrigation ditches. Caleb Turner stood at the edge of his field, hands buried in his coat pockets, breath curling white in the cold. The vines, stripped bare now, held the ghost of summer in their twisted branches. Behind him, the farmhouse exhaled thin plumes of smoke from its chimney, the scent of burning oak drifting into the open air. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds stories. He crouched near the trench where water still trickled beneath the ice. The stream's voice was faint but steady, like it had learned the rhythm of survival. When he brushed his glove through the icy water, his reflection wavered between the ripples. A face weathered by time and healed by purpose. There were fewer lines of anger now, fewer edges. Just the softness of a man who'd stopped fighting the world and started listening to it. From the porch came the sound of footsteps. Ruth walked toward him, her red scarf catching the morning light. She carried a thermos of coffee and handed it over without a word. He nodded in thanks, unscrewing the lid, letting the steam warm his face. They're calling this the Dry Creek Miracle, she said, smiling faintly. The local papers want interviews. Some folks from Sacramento are coming next week. Environmental funding, restoration projects. Caleb chuckled, low and rough. Miracle, huh? Guess they never met a stubborn horse. Ruth tilted her head. You ever see her again? He looked out toward the horizon, where the frost sparkled like ground-up glass. A few days after she left, I found tracks near the spring. Fresh ones. She's out there somewhere. I think that's enough. They stood side by side, sipping coffee, listening to the land breathe. The valley stretched before them, still raw, still imperfect, but alive. The hum of the wind through the grass sounded almost like a hymn. By noon, the frost had melted, leaving behind patches of dark, rich earth. Caleb worked through the fields, repairing fences, checking the new water lines. Every small sound, the creak of wood, the rush of water, the call of a distant hawk, felt magnified, important. He realized how much of life he'd spent half listening, waiting for the next failure instead of hearing what was still trying to live. As he walked toward the far end of the vineyard, something caught his eye. A faint glimmer half buried in the soil. He knelt, brushing away the dirt. It was a horseshoe, old and worn smooth by time, the metal dulled but unbroken. He turned it over in his hands. The curve fit perfectly against his palm. He smiled, not the quick defensive smile of habit, but the kind that came from deep in the chest. "You left your mark, didn't you?" he said softly. "Fair enough." He carried the horseshoe back to the farmhouse and hung it by the door. Not for luck, but remembrance. That evening, he sat on the porch with Ruth, the valley spread before them in the fading gold of sunset. The light washed everything in warm tones. The fences, the hills, even the sky seemed to hum with a quiet contentment. They didn't speak for a long time. Words felt unnecessary. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving this place? You could start over somewhere easier." Caleb shook his head. "No. I think I'd miss the way it teaches me things. Out here, nothing gives itself easy. You have to earn every drop of water, every breath of peace. That's how I know it's real." She smiled. "You sound like a preacher." He laughed. "Maybe just a man who ran out of excuses." The wind shifted then, bringing with it a sound so faint it might have been imagination. A soft, rolling whinny echoing across the hills. Ruth turned her head, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Caleb's hand tightened around his mug. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "I heard." They both looked toward the ridge where the first stars were beginning to appear. For a heartbeat, the light bent across the far slope, catching, something that shimmered copper-red before fading back into dusk. Ruth whispered, "She came back." Caleb didn't move. He just watched the place where the light had been, his eyes glistening in the half-dark. "No," he said quietly. "She never really left." The night deepened, the world folding into shades of blue and gold. The frogs began their chorus by the creek. Somewhere beyond sight, the mare ran through the wet grass, hooves striking the ground like slow, steady drums, the sound of freedom answering the call of forgiveness. Caleb leaned back, his chair creaking beneath him, and closed his eyes. The land no longer sounded empty. It pulsed, steady and alive, like a heart finally finding its rhythm again. In the end, there was no miracle. Only the simple, stubborn faith between a man, a horse, and the piece of earth they had both learned to love. And under the quiet California sky, the earth gave thanks. If this story touched your heart, tell me what part stayed with you the most. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Another true tale of courage, compassion, and the bond between people and the wild.